Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Good morning. Welcome to this course on understanding and reducing greenhouse gas emissions with a focus on scope 1 and 2 emission reduction through building design and construction, and we are in the week 1 of this course, and today is the last lecture of this particular week. Now, what we have done so far in this particular week is we have tried to understand why at all are we going to talk about GHG emissions. We haven't really started talking about greenhouse gas emissions, but why at all are we discussing and where did it all start is what we have been discussing about. So, quickly giving you a recap, we started talking about sustainable development. There was a lot of discussion on sustainable development, and scientists and researchers also started to talk about climate change as early as 1800s, and that was an after effect of industrial revolution. Now, this is established that there is climate change, and we also saw that how do we really determine whether climate change is for real and what are the indicators through which we would know that whether climate change is really happening or not. And after that we also saw that how climate change is going to affect the overall sustainable development, where all are the interrelations between the environmental aspects, the economical aspects, the social aspects, climate change, and hence we were looking at the Agenda 21, MDGs, SDGs, and then specially focusing on the climate, the goal 13, goal 14 of sustainable development goals, which are specifically talking about climate action and the impact of this climate change on aquatic life and all others. In the previous lecture, lecture 4 of this week, we quickly saw that what are the climate risks, what are some of the climate risks that we can directly understand, and the types of risk, how can we calculate the risk, what are the contributing factors to it. Now, continuing with this lecture and kind of summarizing the discussion on sustainable development and climate change, today we are quickly going to discuss what are the impacts of development on different natural elements. So, here we are going to look at the impact of development. Now, when I say development, this is the common understanding of development what we have. So, we are largely talking about the man-made infrastructure and development when we say impact of development. So, let us not confuse and let us not go into the ideological or theoretical connotations of development, the growth of human mind and things like that, but let us restrict it to the man-made built environment, the infrastructure development that we are understanding here. So, impact of such a development, and we are not going into discussing whether this development is sustainable or not sustainable, but impact of this development on land, water, air, and also on the socio-economic aspects of our life. So, let us first start with impact of development on land. Now, to quickly summarize this, to give you a brief, the prominent impacts of development on land have been: 1, desertification; 2nd, biodiversity loss; 3rd is land use, land cover changes; and 4th is urban heat island. We will go over each one of them one by one. So, desertification, very clearly we understand that desert is an area which is devoid of water, moisture in the air, moisture in the soil, underground water, bare minimum amount of water that is necessary to sustain the growth of life, flora and fauna both. So, such an area is classified as a desert. You can find more scientific definitions of that, but the concern here is that our activities, human activities, are leading to increase of this desertification. More and more of the land area today is getting converted into deserts. And what are the reasons? There are several reasons for this desertification. We are talking about the man-made causes of this desertification. So, the most important, the primary cause of this is commodity driven deforestation. Now, what is happening? The world population is increasing. For that, for accommodating and for providing that population, we need more houses, we need to cultivate more crops, we need more agricultural land, we need to set up more industries, we need to mine more and more resources, we need to mine coal, we need to mine oil and gases and a lot of other things. Now, for all of that we need land, and from where will that land come? A lot of times, majority of the times, that land is actually coming from the forests. So, we are carrying out deforestations at massive, large scale and converting the forest land into cities, into agricultural farmland, into industrial land. We are primarily converting the land from forest to this. And what has that to do with the desertification? Because we are reducing the land which is required to absorb the amount of water that is received from the rainfall. So, a lot of surface runoff will happen, but less amount of water is going to enter. Also, all of us know that forests, trees are one of the most important component of balancing the ecosystem. So, it helps in bringing back the rains, maintaining the atmospheric moisture, and when all of that is going, so together it is leading to drying up of the land and this entire atmosphere, eventually leading to desertification. We are already witnessing almost every few months, we have one city which is witnessing almost desert like situation, where the underground water has totally exhausted. There is no underground water, there is no surface water, the moisture in the air is also minimal, bare minimal, and the city, even when the city is there, the people are there, there is no water, and the land, it won't really look like a desert, but it has practically turned into a desert because there is no water. So, this is commodity driven deforestation, wrong forestry practices, shifting agriculture, which is what I just mentioned, urbanization, and also wildfires. This is one reason where some natural forces are also causing the desertification to happen. So, it is not always man-made, but largely the drivers are man-made and some are natural, such as wildfires, but that is again because of climate change, and we have already seen that this is also happening because of the rising temperatures, of reducing humidity in certain areas and increasing humidity in the other areas. So, together all these are causing desertification to increase. The next impact on land of this development is biodiversity loss, and when we say biodiversity loss, we are implying the decline in the number, the variety, the variability and the variety of species and the biological communities in this particular given area. So, we are talking about extinction of species, we are talking about endangerment of the species. This is biodiversity loss. So, all of us must have heard and read about a lot of animal and plant species which have actually become extinct within our own lifespan. A lot of other species, animal, flora and fauna species, they are on the verge of becoming extinct, they are endangered, and this is precisely what we are talking as biodiversity loss. There are several repercussions of this biodiversity loss. There is a lot of ecological imbalance that will eventually happen, and this is also because of our wrongdoings, unsustainable development, so to say. And the reasons for that, primary reasons, is habitat loss. So, we have, when we cut the jungles, when we continue with deforestation, we are actually eating up, we are taking away the habitat of a lot of this flora and fauna, and so they cease to exist. They cannot adapt immediately to the changed surroundings. Some animals would do, for example, monkeys. They have adapted themselves well even in the urban areas, in the urbanized areas, built areas, but a lot of species would not be able to survive, adapt, and hence gradually their numbers will come down, they will decrease, and they will be pushed to a point where they will become endangered or on the verge of extinction. So, we are eating up on their habitats. Second, invasive species. We are modifying the habitat, and hence one species, because there is loss of the original habitat, that species to survive will enter into the other habitat and it will take over. So, this species, which might be a stronger one, will sustain, will survive, but the others will be at the verge of endangerment or extinction. That is where the invasive. So, these are related parameters, but invasive species is where due to habitat loss in one area, some species, a strong species, moves to another area and captures it, overpowers that area. Over exploitation of resources, especially the habitat. So, that is another thing which drives these animals away. We are talking about pollution, adding substances which may be harmful to these animals for flora and fauna is a common driver for biodiversity loss. And then we also have climate change associated with global warming. So, this we have already seen, there are certain animal fish species which cannot survive outside a given range of temperatures. So, if the temperatures become too high or the temperatures become too less, it becomes very cold, either ways in the extremes these animals will not be able to survive. Adaptation is not a quick process, while it happens commonly in nature, but it does not happen immediately. It takes hundreds and thousands of years for one species to adapt and evolve accordingly, according to the changing context. But climate change is associated with the biodiversity loss. One more driver which is within overexploitation is that besides habitat loss, we also carry out habitat destruction or fragmentation. So, for example, there was a huge jungle and through it we have created a highway. So, we might be adding the crossover bridges for the animals to cross, or bridges under the highway to allow the species to connect and to continue to integrate that area. But often what happens is that infrastructure projects like this, the highways, would have divided a larger habitat into two smaller parts. For example, a lion would require some 300 square kilometer as its territory. Now, when we have cut this territory into two halves by passing a highway through it, the lion is actually dependent only on one half of the territory. It will not go to the other half of the territory, and so for its food and its own survival, it has a smaller area to thrive on, to survive on, and that often gradually will lead to a decline in its population, in its health, and in its well-being. So, overall these are the drivers which will lead us to biodiversity loss. Now, again, for the reasons for biodiversity loss, they can be two: one, natural, but here we are largely focused on human driven biodiversity loss, which is what we have seen, but there are other reasons, for example, floods, volcanic eruptions, wildfires, and we have seen examples. There was a terrible wildfire in Australia and a large population of kangaroos was wiped, but since it was a thriving population, it could be revived and it could be saved from becoming endangered. But a lot of such extreme climate events or disruptions can also be one of the reasons for biodiversity loss, but here we are looking at the impact of development on land, and human driven biodiversity loss is a major concern. Next, we are talking about land use, land cover change. Now, if we look at this particular graphic right now, so this tells us that if the entire land surface of the earth was to be divided in or to be represented in the area that it covers for a specific use, we would see that built area is actually not very large. If you look at this, this is the built up area, which is approximately 1%. It covers all villages, towns, cities, infrastructure, everything. It is not very high right now, but it is growing at a very alarming pace. One, that. Two, we have 7% of cropland, and more than that is this 27% of the livestock. Now, this, when we are saying livestock, it is the area that is required for meat and dairy production, for grazing, for growing crops, only for feeding the animals, and this is a huge area. Look at this area. So, we need lesser area for growing crops for human consumption, and we need way larger an area for growing, for supporting the meat and dairy production. Now, somewhere the trends have to be seen of sustainable development, because if we are talking about growing requirement of meat and dairy production, implies that this forest land is going to be converted to the grazing land, or for growing the crops for feeding animals. Now, the area that we are seeing here under the forest is comparatively, here we are talking about only 26% of the forests being there, which is significantly lesser area. We have a lot of land which is barren. We have some part of the land, approximately 10%, which is in glaciers, which is again decreasing, as we have already seen. So, what we have to actually see is that we have to maintain an optimal balance of this land use, land cover. It is changing rapidly. As I said, built up area is increasing rapidly, the area required for livestock is increasing, the area required for cropland is increasing, and all of this area is actually going to go from the forested area. That is the change in land cover that we have to control, and if you look at the graphics, if you look at the data, the numbers, we will see that the rate of change, and it is an increase in built up area, is very, very high. The next impact on land of development is urban heat island. And what is urban heat island? Urban heat island is actually the rise in temperature above the central business district or the constructed part of the city, where the air temperatures increase, and that is because the hard surfaces of the built up area of the urban area, during the daytime they absorb a lot of heat, the solar radiation, and then they re-radiate it during the night when the atmospheric temperature is slightly cooler than the surface temperature of this hard surface, and then it re-radiates. So, there is a trap of heat in this area, and this is primarily because of the hard surfaces that are there, and this is a common phenomena which you might have experienced commonly, that when you move from a city area to a suburban area. So, this is where there are less hard surfaces, there are more green areas, there are more trees, and these trees and green areas, even the barren land, they do not absorb a lot of heat. Trees, when the sunlight falls on it, it absorbs the heat and light and converts it into different forms of energy. It does not re-radiate it back, and that is why during the night the suburban areas are much cooler than the central business districts of the urban areas, and that is what we are knowing as urban heat island, and it has a lot of further repercussions. Now, what happens? The city is becoming hotter, implies we need to provide for cooling more than usual, because the atmospheric temperature is higher, which further implies that there is more air pollution. Everywhere if we have to go, we would require either personal transport or public transport of good quality. There are several health hazards. So, all of these are interrelated issues, but one major impact of development on land is also this urban heat island. Now, let us move to impacts of development on water. Very quickly, these are the broad impacts of development on water. We are talking about changing water cycle, we are talking about acidification of oceans, sea temperature rises, rising sea levels, melting glaciers and sea ice, coral reef depletion, oceanic pollution, and wetland degradation. Some of these we have already talked about, for example, the sea temperature rise, the rising sea levels, and the melting glaciers and sea ice, the ocean acidification. These are all impacts of development on water. Very quickly I am going to go over these. So, influence on water cycle. Now, we have been changing, altering the drivers which kept water cycle in balance. For example, one, we started to extract more and more of groundwater. Earlier, we would depend less on groundwater and more on the surface water. So, if you would remember the villages in earlier times or even cities, there were a lot of tanks, water tanks and ponds where the rainwater would be collected and it would be used largely. Only for drinking would people be depending upon groundwater, and almost all of the rainwater which would be falling in an area would be harvested in the form of these ponds or recharge wells or tanks, the talabs and bawdis that we would have earlier. So, no rainwater would actually be running off to the streams, very less amount of that would actually be running. Now, what we have done? We are extracting groundwater at an alarmingly high pace. So, we are drinking up, we are drying up the groundwater. 2, we are not allowing the groundwater to be recharged, because we have reduced the green cover, we have hard paved the cities, the built up areas. We also do not have a lot of space for rainwater harvesting like ponds and all, we are covering them up. So, water is not allowed to stay and then gradually recharge the groundwater table. The water is now flowing into streams. So, the streams are becoming swelled up during the monsoon season. So, what has it done? It has reduced the level of groundwater, it has increased the stream flow in especially in the monsoon season, but other times we have a lack of water. Now, this stream also is being added with the sewage, which is sometimes and a lot of times in our context not treated wastewater. So, this water, the stream water, which otherwise should have been fresh water through rains or other things, is now getting contaminated too, and so we cannot use this water. This water is available, but it is a waste. Now, there are less number of trees, so there is less humidity in the atmosphere, and so the formation of clouds, that becomes difficult. So, there is erratic precipitation, sometimes there is excessive rain, some other times there is hardly any rain. So, overall if you look at that, so the rate of evapotranspiration also changes, because there is not enough moisture in the soil and there is not enough moisture in the air. So, overall if you see, we have literally disturbed the entire thing, and there are several places where we have influence, for example, cutting down on trees, paving, hard paving the entire areas, covering up the low lying areas, not allowing water to percolate down to the ground. So many drivers, so many individual inputs in the name of development, and that has have a severe impact on water cycle, and that is why we would see that we had to coin new terms such as urban flooding. Now, flooding was known, okay, there was excessive rain in certain areas and we had flooding, but now it is urban flooding, because we clearly know that we have eaten up on the low lying areas. We have taken up all those areas. So, water will come whenever there will be rains, the water will flow to the low lying area and it will flood that area. So, this is a new term, urban flooding, that is because of altering the water cycle, and this is because of the development. So, these are the impacts that we have on water cycle. Ocean acidification, we very clearly know that it is the absorption of carbon dioxide fundamentally changing the chemistry of the ocean, and this is by triggering several chemical reactions that eventually makes the seawater more acidic. This is sea acidification, and it has impact on shellfish, corals and other calcifers. So, eventually what we are looking at is, we are looking at dying coral reef. So, which is what is another impact of development on water. We have already seen that sea temperature rise, and historically the historic data clearly tells us that there has been a significant rise in the sea temperatures, and this is alarming. If it rises by 2 degrees centigrade, almost entire aquatic life will be dead, and we will have dead oceans. I have said that earlier and I am reiterating that, and because of acidification and sea level, the rise in the temperature of the sea, what we have is, we have dying coral reefs. They are vital for sustaining the aquatic ecosystem, the marine ecosystem, and also they protect our shores. Unfortunately, the coral reefs, a lot of coral reefs are dying, and you must search for these terminology, you must read more about it, and you would find disheartening stories that what are we doing to our natural environment. We have already talked about melting glaciers and ice. Look at this particular picture here. The snow cover was somewhere here, the glacier was almost here. This is the line which I am drawing, and it has receded. This must be some 10 odd kilometers that we are seeing in at this scale. This is with almost all the glaciers across the world, irrespective of their geographic location. Almost all glaciers have receded by hundreds of square kilometers, and that is a reality. So, several Google Earth imageries will clearly tell us that how this ice cover, these glaciers, they have been shrinking, they have been reducing, and where is all that water going? We have already discussed that it is going to the sea, and the sea levels are continuing to rise, and thereby pushing the coastal population, making the coastal population vulnerable to the climate change. The next impact of development on water is this oceanic pollution. Again, you would find a lot of documentaries on how oceans are being polluted, especially by plastic. So, this plastic which we are using commonly in our everyday uses, single use plastic, which a lot of tons of waste get generated in almost every part of the world, and the easiest and the cheapest way to get rid of that waste is to dump it in the deep ocean, and there it is entering the aquatic life. It is sometimes coming back to the food chain, into the human food chain, and it is impacting our lives too, but this has impacted negatively our oceans like anything. Then we are also talking about wetland degradation. Again, the human drivers are responsible for that, where we have eaten up on the wetland areas adjoining rivers and ponds and bigger lakes. In the name of development, in the name of constructions, we have degraded those wetland areas. The catchment has been eaten up, and the impact of that is reducing, sinking groundwater levels, reduce and eventually desertification. So, these are the impacts of development on water. Now, quickly moving to impact of development on air, we are primarily talking about these three impacts. One is air pollution, which is one of the most severe concerns of the day. The second is acid rain, and the third one is ozone depletion. Now, air pollution, today we have not a single city in the world probably which would have, okay, some are, but majority of the cities across the world, in whatever country we go, they do not have air quality which is good, which can be considered healthy for human health. That is the scenario that we are looking at, except in some remote areas, and majority of the sources for this air pollution are anthropogenic sources or the man-made sources. Our transportation, our industries, our consumption of energy for maintaining comfortable interiors, the construction, the infrastructure construction, all of that are man-made sources, and these are the sources for air pollution directly. We also have indoor air pollution due to the materials that we are using, due to the amount of energy that we are using to maintain thermally or environmentally comfortable interiors is also a concern today, and it has severe health impact on humans, on health and well-being, starting from our eyes to our lungs, which are most commonly affected, to our heart, brain. We have stomach related issues, we have liver, bones, and even reproduction for that matter. So, it is not just the impact of development on air, we are actually talking about the impact on society, the health and well-being, and eventually we are not realizing it here, but it takes a lot of economic, financial resources to curb that. More investment in the form of providing medical services, healthcare infrastructure. If the cities were cleaner, half of the healthcare systems would not be needed only, because we would have clean air or clean water to drink. Unfortunately, because we have a lot of pollution there and resulting in a lot of disease, that we have to invest in this healthcare is what we are talking about as an economic impact too. Then we have acid rains. I do not have to explain, all of you probably already know what an acid rain is, but very directly acid rain is a result of burning fossil fuels at very high temperatures. That is what primarily we should conclude. So, overall what we are actually seeing, that all these impacts of development on different natural resources are primarily because of the man-made activities, anthropogenic activities, and the root cause of a lot of these activities would come down to burning of fossil fuels for, of course, multiple reasons: transportation, buildings, whatever. Then we have talked about ozone depletion. Earlier also, when we were talking about the historical development of this entire concept, we have talked about ozone depletion. Clearly, there were a lot of concerns when the ozone hole was discovered, though there were not very accurate scientific models, but there was a clear understanding that the ozone layer gets depleted because of the CFCs or HCFCs, chlorofluorocarbons or hydrochlorofluorocarbons, and we need to stop using them. And there came the Montreal Protocol, and with the help of that, in a lifetime of one generation, we have seen that the ozone hole area, it has been reducing. So, if we look at the imagery around 2010, it was a very high, it was a very large hole which was recorded, and gradually we have been able to, the world came together and we have significantly reduced the use of CFCs and HCFCs. We have literally banned some of these substances, and so the ozone hole has already almost recovered. So, this has been a successful treaty, but this was one of the major impact of development on air, where again the reason, primary cause, was burning and emissions of greenhouse gases. Of course, CFCs and HCFCs were part of that. Then we come to the last part of this particular lecture, which is socio-economic impacts of development. Now, there are a lot of socio-economic impacts. The urbanization leads us to a lot of psychological and social problems. For example, isolation, loneliness. How our cities are being designed, how our urban areas are being designed, also determines how psychologically healthy the communities living there are going to be. So, the scale of the city, the design of the city determines that. If we are looking at socio-economic impact of climate change and of development, we are talking about, for example, shrinking productivity of harvest, which implies that there is going to be an increase in the price of all these commodities, food, the basic food stuff, the cost of affording a basic lifestyle will increase, and it will have huge economic repercussions and social repercussions. For example, there could be wars to gain access over certain resources. We have seen, and a lot of scientists suggest that the next world war would actually be fought on water, because we are not taking care of a resource as essential as water. So, there could be more wars to gain access to limited resources. There could be diseases. We have already seen the COVID pandemic across the world. There will be more and more such diseases which will be there, and this is directly due to the unsustainable development that we are going through. We do not have respite areas, we do not have clean cities, we do not have clean air or clean water, and so we are going to be witnessing more and more of such epidemics and pandemics, just like what we witnessed last year. We would have major social impacts such as relocation of whole towns. There are several case studies. For example, very recently we have the example of Cape Town, which has totally dried up. People are fleeing away from there because there is hardly any water. There have been other classic case studies where entire towns were uprooted because there was hardly any water, or the city became extremely polluted for air or for land, and so the entire town had to be relocated, people fled. Now, this is a huge social impact. It is not just shifting of people from one city to the other. It has a lot of emotions in that. People relate to a place, they have livelihood there, they have generations of theirs who have lived in those cities. So, it is a big social impact. We will have, when the price for commodity increases, we will have an increasing gap between the rich and poor, which will further push the crimes between the two communities. So, the underprivileged, the marginalized will always be pushed to commit crimes, to procure resources. So, this gap between rich and poor will increase, and so will the crimes. There will be a greater urban and rural divide also if the development is not sustainable. So, overall we are actually looking at a whole nexus of these problems. So, not just environmental, but looking at social problems and economic problems, and these are all impacts of development which has not been planned in a sustainable manner. We have to look at sustainable development to keep a lot of these problems at bay. Now, while I conclude this particular lecture, I would also like to conclude the entire week, the discussion of this entire week and what all we have seen. The very clear thing is that a lot of these problems are because of haphazard, unplanned, unsustainable development, and the primary root cause of a lot of these problems is our dependence on the unsustainable forms of energy which are being procured, which is being generated from conventional sources of fuel, which emit a lot of greenhouse gases into the environment. So, starting from the discussion about sustainable development, moving on to climate change, climate risks and the impacts of development on different natural resources, we can very clearly conclude that we need to go forward in a sustainable manner, have sustainable development and bring down to close to zero the greenhouse gas emissions. So, this is what the takeaway from this week 1 of the lectures for this ongoing course should be. Thank you very much for joining with me in this course. See you in the next week with a new series of topics, continuing this discussion forward. Thank you very much.